A racist bus driver purposely drives past a black man at the bus stop. He is stunned the next day when the black man steps onto his bus, leading to a shocking confrontation. Marcus Taylor stood at the bus stop, his heart racing as he glanced at his watch. 7:45 a.m. The interview was at 8:30 and he needed to be there early. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, adjusting the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He had rehearsed every answer, gone over his resume countless times, and had even picked out a new tie just for this occasion. Everything had to go perfectly. The bus stop was quiet, just a few people milling about, lost in their own worlds. Marcus's gaze swept over the street, spotting the bus rounding the corner. His heart leapt. He moved closer to the curb, straightening his posture, his hand already lifting to signal the driver. The bus was his lifeline today, the one thing standing between him and a potential job that could change his life. As the bus approached, Marcus caught a glimpse of the driver's face, a white man in his 50s, with a scowl etched into his features. The man's eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment, and in that instant, Marcus saw something cold and dismissive flash across his face. He felt a pang of unease but brushed it aside. This was New York City. Drivers were often grumpy, but then, without even pretending to slow down, the bus roared past, the driver's gaze fixed straight ahead, as if Marcus didn't exist. The bus zoomed by, the wind whipping at Marcus's jacket, leaving him standing on the curb, his hand still half raised in disbelief. "What the hell?" Marcus's voice cracked, barely audible over the receding roar of the engine. He spun around, looking at the few people around him, his chest tightening. He didn't even stop. A woman waiting nearby gave him a sympathetic look. "That driver? He's got a history. If he doesn't like the look of you, he won't stop. Happened to my cousin last week." Marcus's face hardened. He knew what the look of you meant. He'd heard it too many times before, felt it sting too often in interviews, in stores, in passing glances on the street. His hands clenched into fists, the disappointment and anger bubbling up inside him. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice shaking. He glanced at his watch again. 7:50. He didn't have time for this. He needed to catch the next bus, and it needed to be on time. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. "Hey, I'm still at the stop. The bus didn't pick me up," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No, I didn't miss it. He drove right past." He could hear the frustration creeping into his voice, the helpless anger. "I'm trying to get there, okay? I'll catch the next one." He ended the call, shoving the phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. Walk? No, too far. Taxi? He didn't have the money for that, not today. He would have to wait and hope that the next bus driver was different, that he wouldn't look at Marcus and see just another black man to ignore. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. He tried to stay calm, to keep his frustration from boiling over, but it was hard. This wasn't the first time he'd been brushed off, pushed aside, or looked at like he was less than everyone else. It was just the first time it mattered this much. He thought about the interview, the opportunity slipping further away with every second. "Just one chance," he whispered to himself, staring down the street. "That's all I need." Another bus appeared in the distance, and Marcus straightened, his heart pounding again. This time, he stepped forward boldly, his eyes locked on the driver as the bus approached. The new driver, a middle-aged woman, slowed down, her face a neutral mask. Relief washed over him as the bus pulled up, the doors hissing open. He stepped inside, swiping his Metro card. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge of frustration there, a residue of the earlier encounter. As he moved to find a seat, he couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened just minutes ago. That driver hadn't just ignored him. He'd looked at him, made a decision in a split second, and kept going. It wasn't about the time, the schedule, or the traffic. It was about him, about Marcus being black, and, in that man's eyes, not worth the stop. Marcus sank into a seat by the window, staring out as the city blurred past. His mind churned over the incident, his anger simmering just below the surface. He knew he should be focusing on the interview, on his answers, on everything he'd prepared for, but he couldn't. Not completely. Not when he knew that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how well he prepared, there would always be someone ready to push him back down. The bus moved slowly through the congested streets, and Marcus's eyes flicked to his watch, repeatedly. 8:10, 8:15, 8:20. Each minute felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He tried to breathe, to remind himself that he still had time, but doubt gnawed at him. He'd been here before, so close to something he wanted, only to watch it slip away because of something he couldn't control. The thought made his jaw clench, his fingers digging into his knees, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep his focus. Finally, His destination came into view. Marcus jumped to his feet, gripping the overhead bar as the bus slowed. He squeezed past the other passengers, ignoring their annoyed glances, and stepped off the bus, his eyes scanning the street for the office building. He had 5 minutes left, just enough time. He jogged down the sidewalk, his heart racing, his breath quick and shallow. As he reached the front doors, he took a second to smooth his jacket and straighten his tie, trying to push the earlier anger from his mind. He stepped inside, the pristine lobby a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He'd made it, barely. But as he glanced at the clock above the reception desk, a knot tightened in his stomach. It wasn't just the lateness that worried him. It was the knowledge that he was walking into that interview with the residue of that encounter still clinging to him, that feeling of being looked at and dismissed, seen and rejected. Today, that bus driver had reminded him that no matter how hard he tried, there would always be those who saw only his skin. And that thought, more than the ticking clock or the upcoming questions, was what made his chest tighten with a mix of frustration and dread as he headed towards the elevators. Marcus stood in the pristine lobby, the clock above the reception desk reading 8:35 a.m. He was late. He knew it, and he could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating sensation that tightened around his chest. His heart pounded as he approached the security desk, fumbling for his ID. The guard glanced at him, then down at his badge, taking his time to scan it before handing it back. "Elevators to your left," the guard said, his voice indifferent. "Thanks," Marcus replied, his voice strained. He forced a polite smile, but it felt hollow. He knew every second that passed was another nail in the coffin of his chances. He moved quickly to the elevators, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. As he waited for the doors to open, he could see his reflection in the mirrored walls. His suit still crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his face betrayed his anxiety. He looked worn out, like someone who had already been through a battle before even stepping into the ring. The elevator finally arrived with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, hitting the button for the 15th floor. He stared at the numbers as they counted up, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about how this morning had spiraled out of control. The bus driver's contemptuous look, the way he'd driven past as if Marcus wasn't worth the stop. It wasn't just about being late. It was about everything that action represented. The reminder that no matter how hard he worked, there were always going to be people who saw him as less. The doors slid open, and Marcus stepped out into the hallway. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with expectation. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He was here now. He couldn't change the fact that he was late, but he could still control how he presented himself. He had to make the best of it. He walked down the hallway, his steps measured and deliberate, his heart pounding in his ears. The interview room door loomed ahead, closed and imposing. He could feel the tension knotting in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He had to stay calm. He knocked lightly on the door, and a few moments later, it swung open. A woman with a sharp, professional smile stood in the doorway. "Mr. Taylor?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the anxiety coursing through him. "I'm here for the interview." She glanced at her watch, the movement so slight that it might have gone unnoticed, but Marcus saw it. He could feel the judgment in that small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Of course," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Please, come in." He stepped inside, his shoulders tense, his gaze sweeping over the room. 3 people sat at the long table, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in sharp, tailored suits. They looked up as he entered, their expressions a mix of politeness and something else, something guarded and slightly distant. "Good morning," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "I'm very sorry for being late. I ran into some unexpected delays." One of the men, a silver-haired executive with a thin smile, nodded slowly. "We understand. It happens," he said, his voice smooth and unruffled. But Marcus could hear the undertone, the hint of disapproval that lay beneath the surface. "Thank you," Marcus replied, taking a seat. He could feel his nerves thrumming under his skin, but he kept his face calm, his posture straight. "I'm really excited to be here and discuss how my skills align with the position." The woman in the center, who appeared to be leading the interview, leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Let's get started then. Can you tell us about your background and what drew you to this role?" Marcus nodded, launching into the speech he'd practiced so many times. He talked about his experience in community outreach, his passion for marketing, the projects he'd worked on that made a real impact. But he could feel it, the way their eyes seemed to glaze over, the polite but distant expressions on their faces. He wasn't connecting. He wasn't at his best, and they could tell. The frustration bubbled up again, that familiar, bitter anger that had been with him all morning. He pushed it down, trying to stay focused, but it was hard. He kept thinking about the bus driver, about how a single act of discrimination had thrown his entire day off course. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but here he was, paying the price. "And what do you think sets you apart from the other candidates?" asked the man on the right, his tone courteous but with an edge of skepticism. Marcus hesitated for just a second, his mind scrambling to refocus. "I believe my unique combination of experience and perspective allows me to approach challenges creatively and effectively. I've worked with diverse communities, and I know how to build campaigns that resonate with a wide range of audiences." He was speaking clearly, but he could feel the tension in his voice, the strain of trying to hold it all together. He wanted to impress them, to show them he was more than just another late candidate, but he could see it in their eyes. The decision had already been made. He'd walked in with a strike against him, and there was no coming back from that. The woman in the center, Rebecca, nodded, making a note in her folder. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. We appreciate your enthusiasm. Let's move on to your experience with digital strategy. Can you give us an example of a time when you successfully used data analytics to drive a campaign?" Marcus nodded again, diving into another answer, but his mind kept slipping back to the clock, to the time he'd lost because of something that shouldn't have happened. He knew he had the skills, the experience, but none of that seemed to matter now. All they saw was a man who hadn't made it on time. The questions continued, each one feeling like another test he wasn't quite passing. He gave his best answers, but he could feel the energy in the room waning, the atmosphere growing colder. They were polite, professional, but he could tell he wasn't standing out the way he needed to. He could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other, the unspoken consensus forming between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rebecca smiled again, closing her notebook. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Taylor. We'll be in touch soon." Marcus nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said, his voice steady. But inside, he felt hollow. He stood shaking hands with each of them and then walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and he stood alone in the hallway, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, disappointment, and resignation. He knew he hadn't done his best. He'd tried to push through the frustration, to present himself as confident and capable, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he'd been set up to fail before he even walked through that door. As he made his way back to the elevator, his shoulders slumped. He replayed the interview in his mind, thinking of all the things he could have said differently, all the ways he could have handled it better, but it was too late now. The damage was done. The elevator doors slid open, and Marcus stepped inside, leaning back against the mirrored wall. He stared at his reflection, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged. He looked like a man who had already lost, and that realization stung more than he wanted to admit. The ride down was quick, and soon he was back in the bustling lobby. He walked out into the bright sunlight, the noise of the city washing over him. He felt disconnected, like he was floating outside of himself, watching the world move around him while he stood still. He glanced back at the office building, the gleaming glass facade a stark reminder of everything he'd been working towards. It felt so distant now, like a dream that had already slipped through his fingers. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to push the frustration and anger away, but it clung to him, a heavy, suffocating presence. He knew he had to keep moving, had to find a way to bounce back, but right now, it felt impossible. He started walking, his thoughts tangled and heavy. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next, didn't know how to shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be fighting an uphill battle. As he moved through the city, his mind churned with everything that had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the bus driver, the way he'd been dismissed before he even had a chance. It was just one moment, one small act, but it had changed everything. Marcus knew he couldn't give up. He'd been through worse and come out stronger, and he would do it again. But right now, standing in the middle of a crowded street, he felt more defeated than he had in a long time, and that was something he wasn't sure how to overcome. The next day, Marcus found himself standing at the same bus stop, staring down the road. The events of yesterday played on a loop in his mind, each moment a reminder of how close he'd come and how far he'd fallen. The rejection email had arrived that morning, and while it had been polite and professional, the words, "We've decided to move forward with another candidate," were seared into his memory. They hadn't even mentioned his lateness, but he knew. He knew it was the first thing they noticed. He'd spent the morning trying to shake off the anger, to remind himself that it wasn't his fault, but it clung to him like a shadow. His whole future felt derailed because of that bus driver's deliberate decision, and he couldn't let it go. Today, though, he was determined not to let it slide. He'd called in sick to his part-time barista job and had come back to the same bus stop. He watched the street with a kind of simmering focus, his eyes scanning every approaching bus. This time, he wasn't alone. A small group of commuters gathered around, most of them white, and he hoped that their presence would prevent a repeat of yesterday's humiliation. His heart pounded as the bus appeared in the distance. It was the same driver, Jake O'Connor. Marcus could see his face clearly as the bus approached. The same hard expression, the same dismissive gaze. Marcus stepped forward, making sure he was visible. The bus slowed, but Marcus could see Jake's eyes flicking over the passengers at the stop. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when their eyes met, and Marcus felt that cold, familiar flash of disdain. But this time, Jake had no choice. There were other people waiting, and he couldn't just drive past without drawing attention. The bus came to a stop, the doors opening with a hiss. Marcus stepped on, his pulse racing. He moved quickly down the aisle, ignoring the curious glances of the other passengers. He was focused, every muscle tense as he approached the driver. Jake glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he said nothing. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was his moment to confront the man who had, in a single careless act, thrown his future into chaos. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of anger. "Why didn't you stop for me yesterday?" Jake blinked, his face twisting into a sneer. "What are you talking about?" "Yesterday morning," Marcus repeated, his voice rising. "You looked right at me and drove past. I missed an interview because of you." Jake shrugged, his expression dismissive. "Maybe I didn't see you. I have a schedule to keep, you know." "You saw me," Marcus snapped, the anger bubbling up again. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the silence in the bus, thick and heavy. "You saw me, and you made a choice." Jake leaned back in his seat, his hands still on the wheel. "Look, I don't have time for this. I stop when I'm supposed to stop. You got a problem? Take it up with the transit authority." "You had time to stop," Marcus shot back, his voice shaking now with the effort to control his temper. "But you didn't, because you didn't want to pick me up." The driver's eyes flashed with something ugly, and he turned slightly, his voice lowering to a sneer. "You people are always making a fuss about something. Maybe if you didn't cause so much trouble on my bus, I wouldn't have to be so picky about who I let on." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He felt a surge of heat, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Jake replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "You people come on my bus, don't pay, leave trash everywhere. Why should I stop if I don't have to?" A murmur rippled through the bus, passengers shifting in their seats, uncomfortable. Marcus could see a few of them pulling out their phones, their eyes darting between him and the driver. The tension was electric, the air thick with it. "Are you serious?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "You're not stopping because of what?" "Because I'm black?" Jake scoffed, shaking his head. "You're putting words in my mouth. I'm just saying, if you can't behave, don't expect a ride." Marcus took a step closer, his voice low and fierce. "You think you can get away with that? Treating people like they're not even worth picking up? I don't need this," Jake muttered, reaching for his radio. "If you're going to cause trouble, I'll call it in." Marcus's heart pounded. He knew he was on the edge, knew that if he let his anger get the best of him, it could end badly. But he was tired of being polite, tired of swallowing his frustration, tired of feeling powerless. "Call whoever you want," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere until you acknowledge what you did." Jake picked up the radio, his face set in a grim line. "Dispatch, this is Route 57. I've got a disturbance on the bus. Need assistance at the next stop." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The driver was actually calling the cops on him. He could feel the fear creeping in, but he pushed it back. He wasn't going to back down, not this time. The bus pulled to a stop at the next corner, and Jake turned to the passengers. "Everyone off. We're going to be here for a while." There were groans of frustration as people stood and started filing out, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the driver. Marcus stayed where he was, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't believe this was happening. All he wanted was an apology, some acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't okay. But instead, he was being treated like a criminal. The bus emptied, leaving Marcus and Jake alone. They stood there, facing each other, the silence between them heavy and charged. Marcus could see the tension in Jake's jaw, the defiance in his eyes. This man wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to admit he'd done anything wrong. "You know what you did," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, but filled with a raw, aching frustration. "You know what you did, and you don't even care." Jake snorted, shaking his head. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Just another guy looking for a handout." Marcus's vision blurred with rage. He wanted to scream, to shout, to do something to make this man understand the damage he'd caused, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Jake didn't see him as a person, didn't see him as someone with dreams, hopes, and ambitions. To him, Marcus was just another nuisance, another inconvenience to be brushed aside. They stood there, the minutes ticking by, until the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. Marcus felt a surge of dread, but he forced himself to stand his ground. He'd come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. The police car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they approached the bus. One of them, a black man with a weary expression, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the driver. Jake pointed at Marcus, his voice tight and accusatory. "This guy's causing a disturbance, refusing to get off the bus." The officer turned to Marcus, his gaze steady. "Sir, what's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. "This driver refused to pick me up yesterday. I missed an important interview because of it. I just want an apology, some acknowledgement that what he did was wrong." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Okay, let's all take a breath here." He turned to Jake. "Did you refuse to pick him up?" Jake scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't remember. I have a schedule to keep. I can't be stopping at every corner." The officer looked back at Marcus. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but right now you need to step off the bus so we can resolve this." Marcus hesitated, the anger and frustration still simmering beneath his skin. He felt trapped, like no matter what he did, he was the one who would end up losing. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight. "But this isn't over." He stepped off the bus, his heart heavy. The crowd outside watched with a mix of curiosity and unease, their phones still raised, capturing every moment. Marcus glanced back at Jake, who was smirking, a self-satisfied look on his face that made Marcus's blood boil. The officer stepped in front of Marcus, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to stay here, okay? We're going to sort this out." Marcus nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. He watched as the other officer spoke with Jake, their voices low and indistinct. He felt a surge of helplessness, the anger turning inward, burning like acid in his chest. He'd come here to stand up for himself, to demand some small measure of justice, but now, standing on the sidewalk surrounded by strangers, he felt exposed and vulnerable. He'd wanted to be strong, to fight back, but now he just felt tired. The first officer returned, his face neutral. "We're going to file a report, okay? You can go down to the station and give a statement." Marcus nodded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." He turned away, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving only a hollow, aching exhaustion. He'd wanted to make a point, to show that he wouldn't be pushed around, but now he just felt like he'd been pushed further down. He started walking, his mind a blur of anger and regret. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if anything would change. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, his body tense as he watched the police officers approach Jake. The crowd around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, their phones held high, capturing every moment. Marcus felt the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, a strange mix of anger, fear, and determination all swirling together. He had come here to demand accountability, but now, with the police involved, everything felt precarious, like it could tip into chaos at any moment. The officer who had spoken to Marcus earlier walked back toward Jake, his demeanor calm but firm. "Sir, I need you to step away from the bus and speak with us," he said, his voice measured. Jake's face was flushed with anger, his body rigid with barely controlled rage. "I'm just doing my job," he snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. "This guy," he pointed at Marcus, "comes up here, causing trouble, and now I'm the one getting blamed?" The officer held up a hand. "No one's blaming anyone yet. We just need to sort this out. Please, step over here." Jake's eyes flicked toward Marcus, and in that instant, Marcus saw something dark and furious in them, something that sent a chill down his spine. He could see Jake's hands clenching and unclenching, his jaw tight. The man was on the edge, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake spat, taking a step forward. "This guy thinks he can tell me what to do? Thinks he can just walk up and accuse me?" The officer moved between them, his posture tense. "Sir, I need you to calm down." "Calm down?" Jake's voice was a snarl. "I've had enough of this crap. I don't have to take this from him or anyone." Marcus felt his own anger flaring again, his hands trembling as he tried to keep control. "You treated me like I didn't matter," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "You ignored me because of what you thought you saw. That's not right." Jake's face twisted with rage, his eyes blazing. "You want to talk about what's right?" he shouted, his voice rising. "How about this?" Before anyone could react, Jake lunged forward, his hand swinging out in a vicious arc. Marcus barely had time to flinch before the fist connected with his jaw, pain exploding through his face as he stumbled back, the world tilting around him. There was a split second of stunned silence, and then the crowd erupted in shouts and gasps. Marcus staggered, his vision blurred, his ears ringing. He could hear people yelling, could feel hands reaching out to steady him. But everything was a chaotic blur. "Sir, get back!" one of the officers shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion. Marcus blinked, trying to focus, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. He tasted blood, the metallic tang filling his mouth, and he realized with a jolt that Jake had hit him, had actually hit him, right there in front of everyone. He looked up, his vision clearing just in time to see the officers closing in on Jake, their hands on their belts. Jake was still shouting, his face twisted with rage, his fists clenched as if ready to strike again. "You think you can just walk up and tell me how to do my job?" Jake roared, his voice breaking. "You think you're so important, don't you?" The officers moved quickly, grabbing Jake's arms and pulling them behind his back. He struggled, his face contorted with fury, but they were too strong, pinning him against the side of the bus as they snapped the handcuffs into place. "You're under arrest for assault," one of the officers said, his voice loud and clear. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jake was still shouting, his words slurred with anger and desperation. "This is all his fault," he yelled, his voice raw. "He's the one causing trouble. I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus stood there, his hand pressed to his aching jaw, watching as the officers led Jake toward the police car. The driver's face was flushed, his eyes wild and frantic. He kept looking back at Marcus, his mouth moving in a constant stream of curses and accusations. The adrenaline was still surging through Marcus, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He'd come here to demand an apology, some acknowledgement of what Jake had done, but now everything was spinning out of control. He felt a mix of shock, anger, and a strange, hollow sense of victory. The officer who had spoken to him earlier turned back, his face serious but calm. "Sir, are you okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw throbbing with pain. "I'm fine. I didn't think he would actually hit me." The officer's eyes were sympathetic. "We're taking him in. You'll need to come down to the station and give a formal statement." Marcus nodded again, his mind still reeling. "I'll be there." The officer glanced over at the crowd, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief. "It's a good thing you didn't escalate things. This could have gotten a lot worse." Marcus looked down at his hands, still shaking from the adrenaline. "I just wanted him to know he couldn't get away with it." "You did the right thing," the officer said quietly. "Now, let's get you some ice for that jaw." Marcus followed him back to the police car, the crowd slowly dispersing as the spectacle ended. He felt dazed, like he was watching everything from a distance, his body moving on autopilot. He knew he should be feeling something. Relief, satisfaction, maybe even triumph. But all he felt was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He sat on the edge of the sidewalk as one of the officers handed him an ice pack. He pressed it to his jaw, wincing at the cold, but grateful for the numbing sensation. His mind was still racing, replaying the moment over and over again. Jake's face twisted with rage, the flash of his fist, the sudden blinding pain. He looked up as the police car pulled away, Jake's furious face still visible through the window. The driver's shouts had faded, replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. For a moment, Marcus felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly swallowed by the memory of that dismissive sneer, that look that had said Marcus didn't matter. This wasn't how he'd imagined things would go. He hadn't wanted it to end like this, hadn't wanted to be part of a public spectacle. But maybe it was what had to happen. Maybe this was what it took to show people like Jake that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't just trample over others without repercussions. Marcus took a deep breath, the ice pack still pressed to his aching jaw. He felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, a kind of clarity that he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what would happen next, how the legal process would play out, what kind of backlash he might face. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. He stood up, his body aching, but his resolve solidifying. He was going to see this through, no matter what it took. Because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up, about refusing to be silenced or dismissed. With one last look at the now empty bus stop, Marcus turned and started walking. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. And that, for now, was enough. Marcus sat in the hard plastic chair at the police station, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. His jaw still throbbed, a dull reminder of the punch that had knocked him off balance just hours before. The ice pack he'd been holding had long since melted, leaving his hand cold and clammy. The station was bustling with activity, officers moving back and forth, people filing reports, phones ringing. But he felt disconnected from it all, like he was watching everything from a distance. An officer approached, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Taylor, you ready to give your statement?" Marcus nodded, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. "Yeah, I'm ready. The officer gestured to a small interview room off to the side. Right this way. Marcus followed him into the room, his heart heavy. It was small and stark, with a table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light overhead that buzzed faintly. He sat down, the officer taking the seat across from him. A recorder sat on the table, its red light blinking softly. We're going to record this for the official report, the officer said, his voice calm and professional. Just tell us what happened, from the beginning. Take your time. Marcus took a deep breath, then began to speak. He recounted everything, the bus driver ignoring him, missing the interview, the frustration that had built up, leading him to confront Jake. He described the confrontation, Jake's refusal to acknowledge what he'd done, and finally, the punch that had sent him reeling. As he spoke, he could feel the anger and frustration bubbling up again, the sense of injustice that had driven him to confront Jake in the first place. But he kept his voice steady, his words measured. He wanted to be clear, to make sure that his side of the story was heard and understood. When he finished, the officer nodded, jotting down a few notes. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. We'll add this to the report. The next step is for you to decide if you want to press charges. Marcus hesitated, the weight of the decision settling over him. He'd known this was coming, but now, faced with the reality of it, he felt a surge of uncertainty. Pressing charges meant dragging this out, putting himself in the spotlight, maybe even facing backlash. But he knew he couldn't just let it go, not after everything that had happened. I want to press charges, he said firmly, his voice steady. He needs to be held accountable for what he did. The officer nodded again, his expression neutral. We'll move forward with that then. You'll be contacted by a detective to follow up. And, Mr. Taylor, I'm sorry this happened to you. Marcus nodded, a tight smile pulling at his lips. Thanks. I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again. The officer stood, gesturing toward the door. You're free to go. We'll be in touch. Marcus rose slowly, his body feeling heavy and sore. He left the interview room and made his way back to the main lobby, where he paused for a moment, taking in the bustling activity around him. It all felt surreal, like he was in a dream he couldn't wake up from. He stepped outside, the afternoon sun bright and blinding after the dim interior of the station. He blinked, the warmth of the day settling over him, and took a deep breath. He felt drained, every muscle aching, but there was a sense of resolve in him now, a determination that hadn't been there before. As he started walking down the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. An incoming call from his best friend, David. Hey man, Marcus said, his voice tired but steady. Marcus, what the hell happened? David's voice was full of concern. I saw the videos online. You okay? Marcus let out a sigh, his free hand rubbing at his sore jaw. Yeah, I'm okay. Just a lot happened. I'm at the police station. I just filed a report. I can't believe that guy hit you, David said, his voice angry. That's insane. You pressing charges? Yeah, I am, Marcus said, nodding to himself. He can't just get away with this. Good, David said, the tension in his voice easing slightly. I'm proud of you, man. It takes guts to stand up like that. Marcus felt a flicker of warmth at his friend's words, the support cutting through the exhaustion and doubt. Thanks, David. It's been a lot. I know, David said, his voice softening. But you did the right thing. Don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't. They talked for a few more minutes, David offering words of encouragement and support before they finally hung up. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, feeling a little lighter. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had people in his corner, people who believed in him and were ready to stand by him, no matter what. As he continued walking, he thought about everything that had led up to this moment. The missed bus, the confrontation, the punch that had sent him sprawling. It had all felt chaotic and out of control, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was reclaiming some of that control. He still had a lot to figure out. There would be court dates, probably media attention, maybe even backlash from people who thought he was making too much of this, who didn't understand what it meant to be dismissed and disrespected the way he had been. But he was ready to face it, ready to see this through, no matter what came next. He turned a corner, heading toward the subway station. He was going to go home, get some rest, and then figure out his next steps. He felt bruised, battered, but not broken. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to keep pushing forward. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for something bigger, about refusing to let people like Jake think they could act without consequences. It was about making sure that the next time someone like Marcus found themselves standing at a bus stop, they wouldn't be ignored or dismissed. They would be seen, they would be heard, and they would know that their voice mattered. As he descended the stairs to the subway platform, the rumble of an approaching train filling the air, Marcus felt a sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Marcus stepped out of the subway station and into the cool evening air, his body still aching from the day's events. The city lights flickered around him, the hum of traffic and distant sirens blending into a familiar symphony. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion. The police station, the statement, the decision to press charges, it all felt like a blur, as if it had happened to someone else. He needed to clear his head, to process everything. He knew he should go home, get some rest, but the thought of sitting alone in his small apartment, replaying the events of the past few days, felt suffocating. Instead, he found himself walking aimlessly, letting the rhythm of his steps and the cool breeze ease some of the tension that had knotted in his shoulders. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was his mother. "Hey, Ma," he answered, his voice tired but affectionate. "Marcus, I saw the news," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Ma," he said, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "Just a little sore." "It's been a long day." "I can't believe that man hit you," she said, anger and concern mingling in her voice. "After everything you've been through, what are you going to do?" "I'm pressing charges," he said simply. "I'm not letting this go." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sigh. "I'm proud of you, Marcus, but I'm also worried. You know how these things can go. I don't want you to get hurt." "I know, Ma," he said softly, "but I have to do this. It's not just about me. It's about standing up for something." "I understand," she said, her voice gentle now. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," he promised. "I love you." "I love you too, baby," she said. "You call me if you need anything, okay?" "I will," he said again, his heart feeling a little lighter. "Good night, Ma." "Good night, Marcus." He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Talking to his mother always had a way of grounding him, reminding him why he was fighting so hard. It wasn't just for himself, it was for his family, for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed because of who they were. He continued walking, his steps aimless, but his mind clearer now. He thought about the road ahead, the legal process, the possibility of facing Jake in court. It was daunting, and he knew it would take a toll on him, both mentally and emotionally. But he also knew he couldn't back down. This was his chance to make a stand, to show that people like Jake couldn't just get away with treating others like they didn't matter. As he walked, he spotted a small coffee shop still open on the corner. The warm glow of the lights and the soft murmur of conversation inside drew him in. He realized he hadn't eaten since that morning, his stomach tightening at the thought of food. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. The barista behind the counter looked up and smiled. "What can I get you?" "Just a coffee, Black," Marcus said, his voice rough. He hesitated, then added, "And a sandwich. Whatever you have, that's ready." The barista nodded and got to work, and Marcus found a seat by the window, sinking into the chair with a sigh. He stared out at the street, the people passing by, and let his thoughts drift. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, people who would question his motives, who would say he was making too much of what had happened. But he also knew that he couldn't let fear or doubt stop him. This wasn't just about one punch, one man's anger and prejudice. It was about something bigger, about standing up against a system that too often looked the other way. The barista brought over his coffee and sandwich, and Marcus thanked him quietly. He took a sip of the coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through him, grounding him. As he ate, he felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, a clarity he hadn't felt in days. He thought about Jake, his rage, his refusal to see Marcus as anything more than an inconvenience, a problem to be dealt with. That kind of hatred didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built over time, fed by a lifetime of prejudice and ignorance. And while Marcus knew he couldn't change Jake's mind, couldn't undo years of ingrained bias, he could still stand up and say, "No more." He finished his sandwich and sat back, his gaze drifting back to the people outside. They moved with purpose, with lives full of their own problems, their own stories. And yet, in this vast city, Marcus felt connected to them all in a way he hadn't before. He was part of something bigger, something that stretched beyond his own struggles and pain. He glanced at his phone, at the messages from friends and family offering support, at the news alerts that kept popping up, each one a reminder of how quickly things had spiraled. He knew there would be more to come. Media coverage, people's opinions, the inevitable backlash. But he felt ready for it now, ready to face whatever came next. He finished his coffee and stood, leaving a few bills on the table as he made his way out of the shop. The air outside was cool, the city alive with lights and sound. He started walking again, this time with a sense of purpose. Tomorrow, he would follow up with the police, make sure the charges were moving forward. He would contact a lawyer, get advice on what to do next, and he would continue to speak out, to tell his story, to make sure that people knew what had happened, not just to him, but to so many others who had faced the same kind of casual, dismissive cruelty. As he walked, his steps steady and sure, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if justice would be served, if people would listen, but he knew he had to try. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He turned the corner, his apartment building coming into view. The windows were dark, the street quiet. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day settling over him. It had been a long, hard road, and he knew it wasn't over, but he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. He had his family, his friends, and now, more than ever, he had his own strength, his own voice. He climbed the steps to his apartment, the key turning in the lock with a soft click. The door swung open, and he stepped inside, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. He was tired, his body aching, but he felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolve that steadied him. He would rest tonight, gather his strength. And tomorrow, he would keep fighting, keep pushing forward, no matter what, because this was just the beginning, and he wasn't done yet. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the buzzing of his phone. He blinked against the early light filtering through the blinds, and reached over to grab it. His heart sank as he saw the dozens of notifications, texts, missed calls, and emails. He swiped through them, his mind still foggy from sleep. "Call me ASAP. Are you okay? Did that really happen?" He sat up, his head spinning as he tried to piece together what was going on. The events of the previous day came rushing back. The confrontation with Jake, the police station, the decision to press charges. He had known there would be fallout, but seeing it unfold in real time on his phone screen made it all feel more intense, more overwhelming. A text from David stood out among the others. "Turn on the news. It's everywhere." Marcus's stomach tightened. He tossed the covers off and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his heart pounding. He grabbed the remote and turned on the TV, flipping to the local news channel. In a shocking turn of events, a city bus driver was arrested yesterday after allegedly assaulting a passenger. The incident, which was captured on multiple cell phones, has sparked outrage and debate over racial profiling and discrimination in public services. Marcus's face flashed on the screen, followed by shaky cell phone footage of the altercation. He saw himself step forward, saw Jake's enraged face, and then the sudden brutal swing of Jake's fist. He watched himself stumble back, his hand going to his jaw, the crowd's horrified gasps echoing faintly in the background. The passenger, Marcus Taylor, has stated that the driver refused to pick him up the previous day due to racial bias, leading to the confrontation seen in these videos. Taylor has since filed charges against the driver, who has been identified as Jake O'Connor, a longtime employee of the city's transit system. Marcus felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew this was coming, knew that the story would get out, but seeing it broadcast to the entire city, with his name and face splashed across the screen, made it all feel terrifyingly real. The anchor continued, her tone serious. "The incident has ignited a larger conversation about racial discrimination in the city's public services, with some calling for increased training and oversight of transit employees. We'll be following this story closely as it develops." Marcus muted the TV, his heart still racing. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like his entire life had been put on display for everyone to judge and dissect. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this overwhelm him. He had made the decision to stand up, to press charges, and now he had to see it through, no matter what. He picked up his phone again and called David. His friend answered on the first ring. "Marcus, man, are you okay?" David's voice was urgent, filled with concern. "Yeah, I'm okay," Marcus said, though his voice sounded thin and strained to his own ears. I didn't expect it to blow up like this." "Yeah, it's crazy," David said. "Everyone's talking about it. But listen, you did the right thing. People need to know this kind of stuff happens." Marcus nodded, though David couldn't see him. "I know. It's just a lot." "I get it," David said gently. "But you're not alone in this. I've got your back, and so do a lot of other people. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're wrong for standing up." "I won't," Marcus promised, feeling a little of the tension ease out of his shoulders. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it." "Anytime," David said. "You need anything, you let me know, okay?" "Okay," Marcus said, managing a small smile. "Talk to you later." He hung up, feeling a little steadier. He knew he had to face this head on, but it was reassuring to know he had people in his corner. He stood up, stretching. His muscles still sore from yesterday. He needed to get dressed, to get moving, to figure out his next steps. His phone buzzed again. A new email notification. He opened it, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the subject line. Statement from City Transit Authority regarding incident. He clicked on it, his eyes scanning the text quickly. The statement was short and formal, acknowledging the incident and stating that Jake O'Connor had been suspended pending an investigation. It also mentioned that the Transit Authority was reviewing its policies and training procedures. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was something. An acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't okay, that there would be consequences. He knew it was just the beginning, that there would be backlash and resistance, but this was a step in the right direction. He took a deep breath and set his phone down. He had a lot to think about, a lot to prepare for. There would be interviews, probably court dates, and he needed to make sure he was ready for all of it. But for now, he needed to focus on taking things one step at a time. He got dressed, his mind still buzzing with everything that had happened. He felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anxiety, but also a kind of resolve, a determination that was growing stronger with each passing moment. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that mattered. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door. He needed to get some fresh air, to clear his head, to figure out his next move. As he stepped outside, the city seemed to hum with a new energy, the people around him moving with purpose and urgency. He walked down the street, his steps sure and steady. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let fear or doubt hold him back. He was going to keep pushing forward, keep fighting, no matter what. Because this wasn't just about one man's prejudice, one moment of violence. It was about standing up, about saying, enough. It was about making sure that the next time someone like Marcus found themselves standing at a bus stop, they wouldn't have to wonder if they were going to be seen or ignored. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. He wasn't sure where this journey was going to take him, but he knew he was ready for it. He was ready to fight, ready to stand up, ready to be heard, and that, for now, was enough. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and media coverage. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't quite anticipated. Every time he turned on the news or scrolled through social media, there was his face, his story, dissected and debated by strangers who knew nothing about him beyond that one viral moment. He had expected some attention, sure, but the sheer volume of it, the interviews, the headlines, the arguments about racism and justice, and whether he was overreacting, was overwhelming. There were people who supported him, who saw what he was doing as a stand for something bigger. But there were also those who questioned his motives, who accused him of seeking attention or trying to ruin a man's life over a small mistake. He tried not to let the negative comments get to him, but it wasn't easy. It was exhausting, being scrutinized and judged by people who had no idea what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated as less than. He was angry, frustrated, but most of all, he was determined to keep pushing forward. Today was a big day. He was meeting with his lawyer, Emily Vargas, for the first time since deciding to press charges. He had heard good things about her, sharp, experienced, and passionate about fighting for her clients. He hoped she would be able to guide him through what was shaping up to be a long, difficult legal battle. He arrived at the law office a little before his appointment, his nerves buzzing. The receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile, led him to a small conference room. He sat down, his hands fidgeting on the table as he waited. The door opened a few minutes later, and Emily walked in. She was in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a confident, no-nonsense demeanor. She smiled as she shook his hand. "Marcus, it's good to meet you," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I've read through everything, and I just want to say that I'm impressed with how you've handled yourself so far. This isn't easy." "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice tight. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." Emily nodded, opening a file folder in front of her. "I know, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure your voice is heard. So, let's talk about what's next." She went over the details of the case, what they could expect from the prosecution, the evidence they had, the likely arguments the defense would make. She explained the process, from the initial hearing to the potential trial, laying it all out in clear, straightforward terms. Marcus listened carefully, his mind racing. It was a lot to take in, and he felt a flicker of doubt. Was he really ready for this? To stand in a courtroom and face Jake, to have his life dissected and scrutinized in front of a judge and jury. "Marcus," Emily said gently, her gaze steady on his. "This is going to be tough. They're going to come after you. Try to make it seem like you're the one in the wrong, but you're not alone. I'm here, and we're going to fight this together." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not backing down." Emily smiled, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Good, because we're going to need that determination. Now, there's something else we need to discuss." She pulled out a letter and slid it across the table. Marcus picked it up, frowning as he read. It was an offer from Jake's lawyer, a settlement proposal. A hefty sum of money in exchange for dropping the charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. He felt a surge of anger, his hands shaking slightly. "They're trying to buy me off?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "That's exactly what they're trying to do," Emily said, her voice calm. "They know they're in a difficult position. The footage is damning, and public opinion is largely on your side. But this offer tells me something else. They're worried. They know they might lose." Marcus stared at the letter, his jaw clenched. It would be so easy to take the money, to walk away and put this whole mess behind him. But he knew he couldn't. It wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for himself, for others who had been in his position, who didn't have the chance to fight back. "What do you want to do?" Emily asked, her voice gentle. "I want to see this through," Marcus said, pushing the letter back toward her. "I'm not taking their money." Emily nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I thought you'd say that. I'll draft a formal response and reject their offer. We'll keep pushing forward." They spent the next hour going over strategy, what to expect, how to handle media inquiries, and what Marcus could do to prepare himself mentally and emotionally for the road ahead. By the time they finished, Marcus felt drained, but more focused, more sure of himself. He left the office feeling a mix of emotions, anger, determination, and a fierce resolve to see this through no matter what. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. He had come too far to back down now. As he walked down the busy city street, his phone buzzed with another notification. He hesitated, then glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think you're a hero? You're just a troublemaker. Drop the charges before things get worse." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He read the message again, his heart pounding. He had known there would be backlash, but seeing it laid out like that, in a direct threat, was something else entirely. He stopped walking, his breath coming fast. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the street was just as busy and indifferent as always. He forced himself to take a deep breath, to push down the fear that was clawing at his chest. He wasn't going to let this scare him off. He wasn't going to let some coward with a phone number and a grudge dictate his actions. He would tell Emily about the message, take the necessary precautions, but he wasn't backing down. He put his phone away and kept walking, his steps steady and sure. This fight wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had been told they didn't matter. Marcus was tired, he was scared, but he was also resolute. He had started this, and he was going to see it through to the end, no matter what, because this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something that needed to change, and he was ready to be a part of that change. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of preparation and nerves. Marcus spent hours with Emily, going over every detail of his testimony, preparing for cross-examination, and discussing potential outcomes. He felt like he was living in a haze, every waking moment consumed by the case. The media attention had only grown, with news outlets covering the story from every angle, turning his life into a public spectacle. The support he received was overwhelming, messages from strangers, words of encouragement from friends and family. But there was also the constant, grating negativity. People who questioned his motives, who called him a troublemaker, who claimed he was blowing things out of proportion. It was exhausting, but he knew he couldn't let it distract him. He had to stay focused, had to see this through. And now, finally, the day had arrived. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing stone facade. His heart was pounding, his palms sweaty despite the cool morning air. He could see the crowd gathered around the entrance. Reporters, photographers, curious onlookers. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. Everything had led to this moment. Emily was beside him, her presence a steadying force. She glanced at him, her eyes calm and reassuring. "You ready?" Marcus nodded, though he didn't entirely feel it. "Yeah, I'm ready." She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Remember, just be yourself. Tell the truth. You've got this." He nodded again, taking one last deep breath before they made their way through the throng of people and into the courthouse. The air inside was cool, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the marble floors. They moved through security and up to the courtroom, where a small group of people had already gathered. Jake was there, sitting with his lawyer at the defense table. He looked different without his uniform. Smaller, almost shrunken, his face drawn and tense. He didn't look at Marcus as he walked in, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Marcus felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and a strange, hollow sadness. This man had caused him so much pain, and yet seeing him like this, it was hard not to feel some kind of pity, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about feeling sorry for Jake. It was about justice. He took his seat beside Emily, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The courtroom slowly filled. Jurors, court officials, a few members of the public. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone waiting for the proceedings to begin. Finally, the judge entered, and the courtroom rose. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could do this. He had to do this. The trial began with opening statements. Jake's lawyer, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit, argued that the incident had been blown out of proportion, that Jake had been provoked, that Marcus was using the situation to gain attention and sympathy. Marcus felt his anger flare, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew the defense would try to paint him as the instigator, try to twist the story to make Jake look like the victim. Emily's opening statement was powerful and precise. She spoke about the impact of Jake's actions, about how Marcus had been treated not just as an inconvenience, but as someone who didn't matter, who could be ignored and dismissed. She spoke about the larger issues at play, about the importance of standing up against discrimination, and how this case was about more than just one punch. It was about sending a message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Then it was time for the testimonies. Marcus was the first to take the stand. His hands shook as he was sworn in, but he took a deep breath and focused on Emily's steady gaze. She began by guiding him through his story, asking about the events leading up to the confrontation, his feelings when the bus had passed him by, and why he had decided to confront Jake. Marcus spoke clearly, his voice steady despite the nerves. He talked about the frustration, the anger, the feeling of being invisible, of knowing that Jake had made a decision about him based solely on his appearance. He talked about missing the interview, about the impact it had on his life, and how that single moment had brought years of similar experiences rushing back. When it was time for the cross-examination, Jake's lawyer was relentless. He tried to twist Marcus's words, to make it seem like he had been looking for a fight, that he had provoked Jake, that he was blowing the whole thing out of proportion. Marcus answered as best he could, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "You confronted my client because you were angry. Isn't that right, Mr. Taylor?" the lawyer asked, his tone sharp. "I confronted him because he treated me like I didn't matter," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Because he looked at me and decided I wasn't worth his time. And you thought it was appropriate to escalate the situation? I thought it was appropriate to stand up for myself." Marcus shot back, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I wasn't going to let him get away with it." The lawyer's eyes narrowed. "So this is about revenge then? About making him pay?" Marcus shook his head, forcing himself to stay calm. "No, this is about accountability. About making sure people like him understand that their actions have consequences." The lawyer sneered, but he didn't press further. He moved on to the next line of questioning, but Marcus felt a surge of confidence. He had spoken his truth, and he could see a few of the jurors nodding, their expressions thoughtful. The rest of the trial passed in a blur. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and finally, both sides made their closing arguments. Emily's closing was powerful, reminding the jury that this case was about more than just one man's actions. It was about the kind of society they wanted to live in, one where people were treated with respect and dignity, or one where prejudice and hatred could go unchecked. Then, it was time to wait. The jury deliberated for hours. Marcus sat in a small room with Emily, his hands clenched in his lap, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. He tried not to think about what would happen if they lost, but it was hard. He had put everything into this, and the thought of Jake walking away without facing any consequences was almost unbearable. Finally, the door opened, and a court officer stepped in. "The jury has reached a verdict." Marcus's heart leapt into his throat. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a reassuring nod, and then they made their way back into the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, everyone on the edge of their seats as the jury filed back in. The foreperson stood, a piece of paper in her hands. She cleared her throat, her voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake O'Connor, guilty of assault." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and then the room erupted. Marcus felt a rush of relief, the tension draining out of him so quickly he felt dizzy. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. They had done it. They had won. Jake slumped in his seat, his face pale and drawn. His lawyer was already talking to him, but Marcus couldn't hear what he was saying. All he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of validation, of justice finally being served. Emily squeezed his arm, her eyes shining. "You did it, Marcus. We did it." He nodded, still trying to process everything. It didn't feel real. Not yet. But he knew it was. They had stood up, they had fought, and they had won. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, made to feel like they didn't matter. The judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court. Marcus stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before turning to leave. As he walked out of the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted into cheers and applause. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Marcus barely heard them. He felt light, almost weightless, as if the burden he had been carrying for so long had finally lifted. He stopped on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd. There were people holding signs, chanting his name, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. He took a deep breath, raising a hand in acknowledgement to the crowd. He didn't have the words for what he was feeling, but he knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles to fight. But today, he had made a difference. Today, he had stood up and been heard. As he walked down the steps, surrounded by the people who had supported him through it all, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had faced the darkness, the fear, and the doubt, and he had come out the other side stronger, more determined than ever. This was his story, his fight, and it wasn't over. But for now, he would take this victory, this moment of triumph, and hold it close. Because this was what it was all about. Standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced.